Sarah Coleman had not slept more than 5 hours in 3 days. That was not unusual for her. At 42 years old, she had long since stopped expecting the world to be gentle, and the world had long since obliged by delivering one hardship after another, with the quiet efficiency of a machine that never breaks down and never apologizes. She drove her taxi 14 hours a day, sometimes more. Through the grid of downtown streets, she had memorized the way other people memorize song lyrics, not out of love, but out of repetition so constant that the knowledge had seeped into her bones. Her cab was a 10-year-old sedan that smelled faintly of pine air freshener and anxiety, and the meter inside it had clocked more miles than Sarah could count, without feeling a kind of vertigo. She drove because she had to. She drove because her mother, Dorothy, 67 years old and fragile, in the way of someone who has given everything she has to everyone around her, needed medication that cost more than it should. She drove because her younger brother, Marcus, 38 and adrift after losing his warehouse job 6 months ago, was sleeping on her couch and eating her groceries, and promising, each week, that something would turn around soon. She drove because the bank had sent 3 letters in the past 2 months about the mortgage on the small house she rented. And the language in those letters had grown progressively less polite. There was a number in those letters, a deadline, and that number sat in the back of Sarah's mind every hour of every day like a splinter she could not reach. On the morning the collision happened, Sarah had already had the kind of day that makes a person question whether the universe operates according to any discernible logic at all. Her first passenger had left without paying and walked quickly enough into a crowd that she could not follow. Her second had argued with her for 11 minutes about the route she had taken, insisting she had added extra miles deliberately, which she had not. Her third had spilled an entire iced coffee on the back seat and left a $1 tip. By 11 in the morning, Sarah had earned less than $30 and was running on black coffee and the particular kind of exhaustion that sits behind the eyes and makes the whole world look slightly overexposed. She was stopped at a red light on Fifth Avenue, drumming her fingers on the steering wheel and watching a pigeon navigate a discarded sandwich wrapper, when the impact came. It was not catastrophic. It was not a crash in the cinematic sense, all explosion and spinning metal. It was a firm, decisive thud at the rear of her cab, the kind of impact that jars you forward, sends something sliding off the dashboard, and leaves a hollow ringing in the immediate silence that follows. Sarah sat still for 2 full seconds. Then she got out of the car. The vehicle behind her was a black SUV. The kind of vehicle that communicates wealth not through decoration, but through the sheer, unembellished quality of its materials. It was enormous and spotless and had the look of something that had never been inconvenienced. Sarah walked to the rear of her cab and looked at the crumpled section of the bumper, the slight accordion fold of metal that represented, to her, not an inconvenience, but a catastrophe. Repair costs she could not absorb. Insurance complications she did not have the bandwidth to navigate. Lost income from a car that might be out of service. She felt the anger rise in her chest the way water rises in a pipe when the pressure builds past a certain point. And she turned to face the driver of the SUV, who was stepping out with the unhurried movement of someone who has never once needed to hurry. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-40s, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of contained, watchful expression that some people develop when they have learned to keep their reactions private. He was dressed simply a charcoal jacket, dark trousers, but the simplicity was the expensive kind. He looked at the damage with the same unhurried calm with which he had stepped out of the car, and then he looked at Sarah, and he said, "I'm sorry." I looked down for a moment. "This is entirely my fault." Sarah Coleman did not hear an apology. She heard the voice of someone who believed that an apology was sufficient, that words could smooth over the reality of bent metal and missed earnings and a bank deadline that was 30 days away. She heard the voice of someone who had never had to calculate whether a repair bill would mean his mother missed a week of medication. She heard privilege wearing the costume of remorse, and she was too tired and too angry and too worn down by 11 months of barely managing to extend any charity toward it. She told him, in clear and unsparing terms, exactly what his inattention had cost her. She told him what her car meant to her. She told him what a day's work meant to someone who did not have the option of missing it. She was not quiet. The people on the sidewalk paused. A man walking a dog stopped. 2 women waiting for a bus watched with the particular attention of people who recognize a human being at the end of her rope. Ethan Brooks, because that was the man's name, though Sarah did not know it, yet stood and listened to every word. He did not flinch. He did not interrupt. He did not reach for his phone to make the whole thing someone else's problem. When she finished, he said, calmly and without defensiveness, that he would cover all repairs in full, immediately, and that she should not worry about the cost. He reached into his jacket and produced a card, which he held out toward her. Sarah looked at the card, the way a person looks at something they suspect might be a trick. She told him she did not need his charity. She took a photograph of his license plate with her phone, told him her insurance company would be in touch, and got back into her cab. Ethan Brooks stood in the middle of Fifth Avenue and watched her pull away. There was something in his expression that was not quite amusement and not quite admiration, but existed somewhere in the complicated territory between them, the look of a man who has not been spoken to honestly in a very long time, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he did not entirely mind it. Ethan Brooks had built his first company at 26 from a one-bedroom apartment in New Jersey, using a second-hand laptop and a network of people he had convinced to believe in something before it existed. By 30, that company had been acquired for a number that changed his life. By 35, the second company had eclipsed the first. By 40, he was the kind of person whose name appeared in financial publications between adjectives like visionary and self-made, and who existed, to the general public, as a symbol of what was possible when talent and discipline aligned. What those publications did not capture, what the profiles consistently failed to address, was the quality of the silence inside the 17-room house in Westchester where he lived alone. His wife, Caroline, had died 4 years ago, not in any dramatic or sudden way, but in the slow, grinding manner of a disease that takes everything incrementally, over 18 months, until the person you love is present only as a diminishment of themselves. They had no children. Ethan had thrown himself back into work with a focus that his colleagues mistook for resilience, and that he understood, privately, to be a very sophisticated form of not having to be still. He had established a charitable foundation 3 years ago, under a name that did not reference him, through which he funneled a portion of his annual income into programs that supported working families, medical debt relief, and legal assistance for people who could not afford it. He did this quietly, because he had no interest in being publicly celebrated for decency, and because Caroline had always said that the most meaningful things a person does are the ones they do when no one is watching. He thought about the woman in the taxi more than once in the days that followed the accident. Not romantically, that would come later. And slowly, and with the particular caution of someone who has learned that feeling arrives whether you want it to or not. He thought about her in the way you think about someone who has reminded you of something you had started to forget. There was an authenticity to her anger that he found impossible to dismiss. Most people, when they encountered him, performed a version of themselves calculated to make a good impression. This woman had performed nothing. She had simply been exactly what she was. Meanwhile, in the small house on Clement Street that Sarah shared with her mother and her brother, the machinery of financial pressure continued its inexorable operation. The bank's third letter arrived on a Wednesday. It was shorter than the previous two, which Sarah had learned was not a good sign. Brevity, in correspondence from financial institutions, typically indicates that the time for elaboration has passed. Her mother asked her, over dinner that night, whether everything was going to be all right, in the soft, careful way of someone who suspects the answer but doesn't want to force it into the open. Sarah said yes. She said it with the conviction she had been rehearsing for months, the conviction of someone who has decided that their family's peace of mind is worth the cost of a private despair. Dorothy Coleman nodded and ate her soup and did not ask again, because she had raised a daughter who told the truth, except when the truth would frighten the people she loved, and she recognized the particular quality of that exception. 2 days after the bank letter arrived, Sarah was sitting in her cab between fares, eating a sandwich in a parking structure on 2nd Street, when the face of the man from the accident appeared on the television screen mounted above the parking attendant's booth. It was a news segment. The headline read, "Brooks Technologies announces $50 million clean energy initiative." Below the headline, in letters slightly smaller, Ethan Brooks, CEO, age 44. Sarah put down her sandwich. She looked at the screen for a long moment. She thought about the sidewalk on Fifth Avenue, the bent bumper of her cab, the way she had stood in traffic, and told a billionaire exactly what she thought of him. She felt something that was not quite embarrassment. Sarah Coleman did not embarrass easily, but was perhaps a cousin of it, a recognition that she had made certain assumptions about a person she did not know, and that the assumptions had not been entirely fair. She pushed the feeling aside. She told herself that a man could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars and still behave carelessly. She told herself that wealth and character were not the same thing, which was true. What she did not tell herself was that she had been watching the segment for 3 full minutes. The second meeting happened on a Thursday, late in October, under a sky that had the particular gunmetal quality of early evening in autumn, when the light goes fast and the streets feel emptier than they are. Sarah received a dispatch call for a pickup at the Meridian Hotel on Park Boulevard, a corporate event. The note said, "Conference attendees needing rides." She pulled up to the entrance, where a small queue of people in business attire waited under the awning, and when the door opened and her next passenger folded himself into the back seat, Sarah knew immediately who it was. The recognition was mutual and instantaneous, and for approximately 4 seconds, neither of them said anything. Ethan looked at the driver's seat, at the back of Sarah's head, and then at the rearview mirror, where her eyes were watching him with an expression he could not quite read. He said, "Well," she said, "where to?" He gave the address, a building on the north side of the financial district, and they pulled into traffic, and the silence between them had the specific density of 2 people who have something to say and are each waiting for the other to say it first. Ethan broke first. He said he hoped the car had been repaired to her satisfaction. Sarah said the insurance company was handling it. He said he had called the insurance company himself and asked that the claim be processed as a priority. She glanced at him in the mirror and said she hadn't asked him to do that. He said he knew. Another silence. The radio was playing something soft and indistinct. It was Sarah who opened the larger conversation. And she did it the way she did most things, directly, without preamble. She said that she'd looked him up. She said she didn't mean that as a compliment or a criticism, just as a fact. He said he supposed that was fair. She said she had a hard time believing that someone worth what he was worth genuinely cared about the things the news segment had said he cared about. He looked out the window for a moment before responding. He told her that he had grown up in a 3-room apartment in Newark, that his mother had worked 2 jobs simultaneously for most of his childhood, that there had been a winter when he was 9 years old, when the heat in their building was out for 6 weeks, and his mother had made a game of it, called it camping, and that he had believed her until he was old enough to understand what it had cost her to maintain that fiction. He said he had made a great deal of money, and that the money was real, and that he understood the ways in which it had made him different from the person he used to be. He said he wasn't sure that was always a good thing. Sarah listened. She did not say anything for a block and a half. Then she said she still thought he drove too fast. He said he had been checking a message, which was careless, and he had no defense for it. She said at least he admitted it. He said he tended to think that denying obvious facts was a waste of everyone's time. They were approaching his destination. He reached into his jacket, produced a card, the same card, or one exactly like it, and set it on the center console between the front seats. He said the same thing he had said on Fifth Avenue, that if she ever needed help, she should call. This time he said it quietly, without ceremony, as though it were simply true rather than polite. Sarah looked at the card. She did not pick it up. But she also did not tell him to keep it. When he got out of the car, he thanked her, and she watched him walk into the building before she pulled away from the curb. The card sat on the center console, all the way back across the city. By the time she reached home, she had put it in the pocket of her jacket. The trouble with Marcus had been building for longer than Sarah had allowed herself to acknowledge. She had known, at some level, that her brother's unemployment was not the whole story, that there was an anxious, evasive quality to him in recent months that exceeded the demoralization of job searching. She had attributed it to depression, to shame, to the specific wound of a man in his late 30s who has not found his footing. She had been generous in her interpretation because Marcus was her brother and because generosity toward family is both the most natural impulse and the most dangerous one. The full shape of the problem revealed itself on a Sunday night in late November, when Marcus came into the kitchen looking the way people look when they have been carrying something too heavy for too long and have finally run out of the strength to pretend it isn't heavy. He sat down at the table. He put a manila folder on the table. He said, "Sarah, I need to tell you something. And I need you not to say anything until I've finished." She sat down across from him and watched his face and felt the particular cold clarity of someone bracing for impact. He had met a man named Victor at a community center job fair 4 months ago. Victor had described an investment group a legitimate-sounding venture. Marcus had believed that helped working people build passive income through a pooled financial instrument. The paperwork had looked official. The office where he'd signed the documents had been professional, with real furniture and a receptionist and framed certificates on the walls. Marcus had signed several documents. He wasn't entirely sure how many, and had recruited 3 people he knew from his old warehouse job to participate as well. He had received a small payment in the first month, which had seemed like confirmation. In the second month, the payment stopped. Victor's phone went to voicemail. The office, when Marcus went back to it, was empty. And then, 2 weeks ago, men had begun appearing. Not in a dramatic way. A car parked outside the house for several hours. A phone call, with no one on the other end. An envelope left in the mailbox, containing a single sheet of paper with Marcus's signature on it, one of the documents he had signed, and no other message. The implication was clear without being stated. The documents Marcus had signed, he now understood, were connected to something far larger and more serious than a failed investment scheme. His name was on paperwork that implicated him in transactions he had not understood and could not explain. Sarah sat with the folder in her hands and looked at her brother's face, and understood that the ground beneath her family had shifted in a way that could not be shifted back by willpower or overtime hours. She called 2 lawyers, whose numbers she found online. One charged a consultation fee she could not afford. The other returned her call 2 days later, and, after she had explained the situation in broad terms, told her that the matter sounded complex and that his retainer for a case of this nature would be $15,000. She sat on the edge of her bed after that call and looked at the wall for a long time. She thought about her mother's face at the dinner table, the careful, trusting way Dorothy looked at her when she said everything would be all right. She thought about the card in her jacket pocket. She did not call that night. She did not call the next morning. She called on the 3rd day, from the parking lot outside a grocery store, sitting in her cab with the engine off, because she needed the complete silence of an enclosed space to get through the conversation without her voice breaking. A man answered who identified himself as Ethan's assistant. She gave her name. There was a pause of less than 30 seconds. Then, Ethan was on the line. Ethan had spent enough years in boardrooms and courtrooms, adjacent to lawyers and investigators, and people who had made it their life's work to understand the mechanics of large-scale financial deception, to recognize within the first 10 minutes of Sarah's account that what she was describing was not a small fraud. The structure she outlined: the professional front, the legitimate-seeming paperwork, the targeted recruitment through community channels, the implied threat following exposure matched patterns he had seen before, in cases that had taken years to fully unravel, and that had destroyed families who had the misfortune of being tangential to them. He met her the following morning at a coffee shop 2 blocks from her house, a place she had suggested, on her territory, which he respected as the choice it was. She arrived exactly on time, which he noticed. She ordered black coffee and did not make small talk, which he also noticed. She put the manila folder on the table and told him everything, with the same quality of directness he had observed in the middle of Fifth Avenue and in the rear-view mirror of her cab. No drama, no performance, just the clear-eyed accounting of someone who has decided that the truth is the only thing worth working with. He read the documents in the folder carefully. He asked several questions, specific, technical questions about dates and names and the nature of the transactions described, and when she answered them, his expression grew progressively more serious, in a way that he did not attempt to soften for her benefit, because he had understood within the first exchange that she did not want to be protected from the severity of her own situation. What she wanted was someone who would tell her the truth and then help her do something about it. He told her that the company whose name appeared on the documents was a subsidiary of a financial group that had been under informal investigation for 18 months. He told her that this was not public knowledge. He told her that his foundation's legal team had been building a parallel file on this organization in connection with complaints they had received from 3 other community groups in the state, and that the documents she had just shown him contained names and signature trails that would be of significant interest to the investigative process. He told her that Marcus had not understood what he was signing, that his exposure was real but manageable if addressed correctly, and that he was going to call his legal team that afternoon. Sarah sat across from him and processed this. She asked him why he would do this, not combatively, not with suspicion. She had moved past suspicion by that point, or at least past the reflexive variety, but with genuine puzzlement, the honest confusion of someone trying to understand a kindness they have not been offered before and cannot immediately place in a recognizable category. He said that his foundation existed for exactly this kind of situation. He said that no one should lose their home or their freedom because someone with resources and no conscience had exploited their trust. He said it plainly, without apparent awareness that it was an extraordinary thing to say, and that plainness was what convinced her. She had learned, across 42 years, to distrust the performance of generosity. This was not a performance. Within 48 hours, Ethan's legal team had met with Marcus, reviewed all documents in the folder, and filed a protective motion that temporarily suspended any civil claims against him pending investigation. An investigator from the foundation began building a comprehensive timeline. Ethan arranged for Dorothy to stay temporarily with a friend of his who had a guest house, a precaution against further intimidation attempts, presented to Dorothy as an invitation to a restful place in the country, which Dorothy accepted, with the gracious acceptance of someone who knows they are being protected and chooses to let the protection happen without forcing anyone to admit it. For the first time in 3 months, Sarah slept more than 5 hours. What Sarah did not know, what Ethan had not told her during their meeting at the coffee shop, because the knowledge was still incomplete and he did not share partial pictures, was the full dimension of what they were dealing with. The investment fraud that had snared Marcus was not a standalone operation. It was the visible surface of a financial architecture that had been built, carefully and over many years, by people who understood how to use legal complexity as camouflage. At its center was a network of shell companies connected to a real estate and investment group that had been operating with the quiet endorsement of at least 2 local officials, whose names appeared in the financial records Ethan's team had spent 18 months assembling. The organization had been targeting working-class communities, systematically identifying residents through community events, job fairs, and neighborhood organizations, presenting investment vehicles that appeared to offer genuine financial mobility, collecting signatures that created legal liability for participants, and using that liability as leverage when questions arose. The genius of the scheme, from the perpetrator's perspective, was that its victims were people who were unlikely to have immediate access to sophisticated legal counsel, whose credibility would be questioned if they raised complaints, and whose desperation for financial improvement made them uniquely vulnerable to the precise kind of offer they had been given. Ethan had encountered the organization's fingerprints 3 years earlier, while reviewing a series of complaints submitted to his foundation by a community organization in a neighboring county. He had begun building a file. It was slow, careful work, the kind of evidentiary construction that cannot be rushed without compromising its validity. And he had been perhaps 18 months away from having something comprehensive enough to take to federal bations investigators when the accident on Fifth Avenue had put him in the back of Sarah Coleman's cab. He understood, sitting in her kitchen one evening while his investigator reviewed documents, and Sarah made coffee, and Marcus sat at the table looking like a man who has been given a temporary reprieve from a sentence he didn't earn, that the universe operates with irony, far more sophisticated than anything a novelist would dare to construct. He had also understood, somewhere in the middle of the previous week, that he was personally exposed. The organization had good intelligence, they knew who was building cases against them, and they had, in the past, been effective at dismantling those cases through pressure and misdirection. The fact that Ethan had now become visibly involved in defending a family directly connected to one of their operations meant that his file, his timeline, the entire evidentiary structure he had spent 3 years building, was now a target. He did not tell Sarah any of this. He told himself it was because there was no benefit to burdening her with the larger picture while she was managing an immediate crisis. He was not entirely wrong, but there was another truth running alongside that one, which was that Sarah Coleman had a quality of perception that he had begun to find unsettling in the most interesting possible way, and that he suspected, if he told her the full shape of the danger, she would insist on being part of managing it. He was right. He simply had not anticipated how that would save him. The retaliation came in the first week of December, during a cold snap that frosted the windows of every building on Clement Street and turned the city into a landscape of pale, brittle light. It came not as a single event, but as a sequence of pressures applied simultaneously. The way a hand tightens rather than strikes. On Monday, Sarah discovered that her checking account had been frozen, following a fraud alert triggered by a complaint she had not filed. On Tuesday, a brick came through the window of the front room of her house at 2 in the morning. Not a rock, not an accident, but a specific, deliberate message delivered in the language of broken glass. Dorothy was not injured. She was terrified. On Wednesday, Marcus did not answer his phone. By evening, he had not returned any calls or messages. By midnight, Sarah understood that he was gone. She called Ethan at 12:30 in the morning. He answered on the second ring. She told him, without preamble, that her brother was missing. Her voice was controlled in the way of someone who has made the decision that falling apart is not currently an option and who will make a different decision only after the crisis has passed. Ethan told her to stay at home, lock the doors, and not answer the door for anyone except him or a member of his team. He told her he would be there within the hour. He was there in 40 minutes. Sarah opened the door and looked at him standing on the step in the cold, and something passed across her face, not gratitude exactly, not relief exactly, but something that contained elements of both, and also something harder to name, a recognition that had been accumulating for weeks, and that she was not yet willing to put into words. She let him in. She showed him the broken window, already covered with a piece of cardboard that Marcus had cut from a box before he disappeared. She sat at the kitchen table and told him everything she knew about the past 48 hours while he made calls. The investigator found a trace of Marcus's phone within 2 hours, a signal that had gone dark in an industrial district on the east side of the city. Ethan mobilized resources with the efficient calm of someone who has dealt with crises before and knows that the most important thing you can bring to them is the ability to think without the paralysis of fear. He did not minimize what Sarah was feeling. He also did not let her stay inside it. He moved her through the night with a purpose that gave her something to do with the energy that would otherwise have become pure terror. And she moved with him, and by 4 in the morning they had a location, and by 6 in the morning Marcus was found physically unharmed, shaken, locked in a storage unit by 2 men who had believed that removing him from the situation would interrupt the investigation, and by 7 he was sitting in Sarah's kitchen drinking the coffee his sister had made him, looking at the table and breathing carefully. The way people breathe when they have been very frightened and are trying to come back to themselves. Dorothy, reached by phone at the guest house in the country, was told that everything was fine and that she should stay where she was for a few more days and enjoy the quiet. She said she supposed she could manage that. 10 days after Marcus was found, Ethan received confirmation from the lead investigator that the evidentiary file was complete. The case had matured from 18 months of careful accumulation to something that could now be presented to federal investigators with a reasonable expectation of action. The plan was to deliver the file simultaneously to the FBI field office and to a journalist at a national outlet who had been working on a parallel story about predatory financial schemes targeting working-class communities. The simultaneous release was important. It created a redundancy that made suppression of the story much harder and would force immediate official response. Ethan scheduled both deliveries for a Friday in mid-December. He told almost no one. He told his investigator, his lead attorney, and, reluctantly, his assistant. He did not tell Sarah because he had decided, in the way that intelligent people sometimes decide things that later prove to be mistakes, that limiting the circle of knowledge was the safest approach. Sarah found out about the delivery schedule by accident, on the Thursday evening before it was supposed to happen. She had stopped by Ethan's office building to drop off a document his attorney had asked her to sign, a witness statement relating to her family's experience with the organization, and while she was waiting in the lobby, She overheard a conversation between two men she did not recognize. They were speaking quietly, standing near the elevator, and the quality of their conversation, the specific cadence of people speaking carefully in a space they do not entirely trust, made her slow her walk without appearing to. She heard a name. She heard a time. She heard the phrase, the exchange point. She did not hear everything, but she heard enough to understand that the two men were aware of Ethan's plan and were discussing something that was going to happen at the location where the file transfer was supposed to take place, and that whatever they were discussing was not supportive of the plan's success. She called Ethan from the lobby, standing in the corner near the building directory with her back to the room. He did not answer. She called his attorney, who put her through to his assistant, who said Ethan was in a meeting and could she leave a message. She left a message. She left a very specific message, describing what she had heard and where she had heard it and from whom. And then she went back to her cab and sat there for a while, thinking. She did 3 things in the next 2 hours. First, she drove to the address she had inferred from the conversation, a parking structure on the west side, near the water, and circled it slowly, observing the layout. Second, she called the journalist whose name she had seen on a piece of correspondence in Ethan's office and told him, in the most condensed version of the story she could manage, that the delivery location had been compromised and that the exchange needed to happen at a different address. The journalist, who had been in the business long enough to trust the instincts of people who called him with urgency, listened carefully and said he understood. Third, she went back to Ethan's building and waited in the lobby until he came out of his meeting. When she told him what she had done, his expression went through several changes in rapid succession. He started to explain why the location had been chosen, why he believed it was secure. And she stopped him, not unkindly but firmly, and said that the 2 men she had overheard had been standing in his lobby, which suggested that the security of his planning process had already been compromised. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "You rerouted the journalist." She said she had. He said, "Without telling me first." She said she had tried to tell him first. He looked at her for a long time with an expression that contained, if she had been paying a different kind of attention, a great deal more than professional respect. The original location, as the FBI later confirmed, had been set up with 2 men stationed inside and a third outside, along with a device designed to intercept and copy the physical files before Ethan's attorney could log their delivery. Had the exchange gone ahead as planned, the evidentiary file would have been compromised, potentially stolen or tampered with, in a way that would have invalidated months of work and, more importantly, exposed Ethan to a personal legal attack that the organization had been preparing for weeks. Sarah's intervention, made on instinct and incomplete information, had prevented all of it. The arrests came in the second week of January, after the FBI had had time to act on the file, and the journalist's story had run in 3 separate publications on the same morning, creating the information saturation that Ethan's attorney had always said was the necessary precondition for the story to be too large to contain. The organization's primary operators, 7 individuals, including the man named Victor, who had approached Marcus at the job fair, were taken into custody within 48 hours. The 2 local officials, whose names appeared in the financial records, resigned from their positions before charges were formally filed and then were charged anyway. The shell company structure was publicly mapped in a detailed diagram that ran in a financial publication and was subsequently cited by 3 congressional staffers in separate statements about the need for better oversight of community-targeted investment vehicles. Marcus's name appeared nowhere in the coverage except in a single line in one article where he was described as one of hundreds of community members who had been deceived into participating without understanding the nature of what they were signing. His attorney, Ethan's attorney, acting on behalf of the foundation, filed for and received a formal declination of prosecution within 30 days. The document that cleared him was 3 pages long and used language that was, by the standards of legal documentation, unusually emphatic in its conclusion that Marcus Coleman bore no culpability for his involvement. The restitution process for the organization's victims was slower, as these processes always are, but Ethan's foundation had anticipated this and established a bridge fund that provided immediate relief to the most vulnerable families, while the formal restitution worked its way through the court system. Dorothy Coleman came home from the guest house on a Tuesday afternoon in January, walked into the kitchen of her house on Clement Street, and found it warm and bright and full of the particular quality of safety that comes not from the absence of threat, but from the active presence of people who have chosen to protect you. Sarah stood in the courtroom gallery on the day the primary charges were formally filed. In a row of people who had been connected to this case in ways both large and small, and watched the proceedings with the focused attention of someone who is storing each detail carefully. She had given her formal witness statement 3 weeks earlier, in a conference room on the 14th floor of a federal building, and she had delivered it with the same quality of directness that had defined every other significant moment of this chapter of her life. The assistant U.S. attorney who took her statement had told Ethan's attorney afterward that she was one of the clearest and most composed witnesses he had worked with, which Ethan's attorney had relayed to Ethan, and which Ethan had found unsurprising. At a press conference following the filing of charges, Ethan was asked about the investigation and about his foundation's role in it. He spoke about the work of his legal and investigative team. He spoke about the pattern of predatory targeting of working-class communities and the systemic failures that allowed organizations like this one to operate across multiple years. And then he spoke, without being asked, about Sarah Coleman, about her precision, her courage, and her specific intervention on the Thursday evening in December that had ensured the delivery of evidence reached the people who needed it intact. He used her full name. He said that the case had many architects, but that her contribution was the one he was least able to account for in any rational model of how things were supposed to go. He said it the way people say things when they mean considerably more than the words they have chosen. Sarah was not at the press conference. She was driving her cab across the city, in the thin winter light of a Tuesday afternoon. She found out about what he had said when she got home that evening, and her mother showed her the clip on the small television in the kitchen. She watched it once. Then she watched it again. Then she went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific quality of being seen by someone who has taken the trouble to look. Spring came to the city the way it always does in the northeastern United States, not all at once, not in a clean break, but in increments and reversals, warm days followed by cold ones, the trees making careful, tentative offers of green before committing fully. By April, the house on Clement Street had a new front window, professionally installed, and the cardboard was long gone. The mortgage arrears had been addressed through a legal settlement process connected to the restitution proceedings, which had established that Sarah's family's financial destabilization had been a direct consequence of the organization's activities, and that this destabilization was compensable. The bank's letters had stopped coming. Dorothy Coleman underwent her surgery in March, at a hospital whose billing department had been contacted by Ethan's foundation 3 weeks before the procedure. The surgery was successful. Dorothy came home after 4 days and spent the first afternoon back in her garden, which was small and not particularly well organized, but which she regarded with the affection of someone who has tended something for years and finds the tending itself to be the point. She told Sarah, while she was potting a plant near the kitchen window, that she thought the world was a better place than Sarah gave it credit for. Sarah said she was thinking about revising her position on that. Marcus found a job in February with a logistics company whose office manager had once received assistance from Ethan's foundation in a different capacity and who had a policy of looking closely at applicants whose gaps in employment had complicated explanations. He was good at the work. He was reliable. He called Sarah every Sunday, which he had not done in the years before all of this. And those phone calls had the quality of conversations between people who have been returned to each other and who understand, having been temporarily separated, what the return is worth. Ethan launched the Cornerstone program in March, a formal initiative under the foundation's umbrella that provided financial literacy, education, legal resource navigation, and emergency support services to working families in the city's lower-income neighborhoods. He had been planning it for 2 years, but the specifics of its structure had sharpened considerably over the past 5 months, shaped in part by a series of conversations with a woman who had a precise and unsparing understanding of what it actually meant to navigate the gap between a crisis and the resources that existed to address it. He asked Sarah to serve on the advisory board. She said she would think about it, which meant yes, but that she needed a week to get comfortable with the idea of walking into boardrooms. She joined in April. They did not talk about what they were to each other for a long time. There was too much happening, And then there was the particular awkwardness of two people who have shared something significant and are each waiting, with more patience than they would like to admit, for the right moment to acknowledge what the sharing has created. They had lunch twice in March. They walked along the waterfront on a Sunday afternoon in April and talked for 3 hours without noticing the time. He told her more about Caroline not because he wanted her sympathy but because he had decided that she was someone he could tell things to, which was a rare and serious determination. She told him about her father, who had died when she was 17, and whose absence had shaped the particular quality of her self-sufficiency in ways she was only beginning to understand with any precision. She kept driving her cab. She liked driving, liked the solitude of it, the way the city looked from behind the windshield, the anonymous kindness of transporting people from one place to another and asking nothing of them except the fare. She drove fewer hours now, because the immediate financial pressure had eased, and she drove with a different quality of attention, not the exhausted, grinding attention of survival, but something lighter and more curious. She noticed things she had been too tired to notice before. She had time to notice them. One morning in early May, on a clear Tuesday, when the city had finally committed to warmth, and the light was doing something generous with the new leaves on the trees along the avenue, Sarah was driving her cab south on Fifth Avenue, the same street, the same stretch of blocks, where the collision had happened 6 months before. She slowed for a red light at the intersection. She looked at the spot where it had happened, where she had stood in the middle of traffic and delivered her anger to a man she had never met, and felt the distance between that morning and this one as something almost physical, a kind of vertigo in reverse, the sensation not of falling but of having climbed a great distance without being fully aware that you were climbing. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she now knew by heart, which said, simply, "Advisory board meeting confirmed for Thursday. Are you ready for this?" She looked at it for a moment. The light turned green. She put her phone in the cup holder and pulled forward into the intersection. And she was smiling, not the careful, performance smile she had been offering the world for months, when she needed to reassure someone, but the real one, the one that started in her chest before it reached her face. 2 blocks south, Ethan Brooks was standing on the sidewalk outside his foundation's new office, watching the morning traffic. He was waiting for his attorney. He was also, with a portion of his attention that had nothing to do with attorneys or advisory boards or the carefully assembled machinery of his professional life, watching the traffic go by in the specific way of someone who has developed the habit of looking for a particular vehicle among the many. He did not see the cab. It had already turned east, onto a different avenue, carrying Sarah Coleman toward the rest of her morning. But he kept looking, because some things, once they become habit, are worth keeping. There is a particular kind of meeting that the world arranges without asking your permission, the kind that arrives wearing the costume of an accident, presenting itself as inconvenience or collision or anger or bad luck, and that only reveals its actual nature in retrospect when you are standing far enough from the moment to see its full shape. Sarah Coleman and Ethan Brooks had met in the middle of traffic, through the medium of a crumpled bumper and a great deal of justified fury, and what had followed had been dangerous and frightening and expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money. It had also been the kind of experience that shows you who you are, by forcing you to be exactly that, without the protective covering of ordinary routine. She had discovered, over those months, that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to keep moving through it, and that the decision is easier when you are not making it alone. He had discovered that the distance he had placed between himself and genuine connection, the careful, manageable distance of a man who had been very thoroughly taught by grief what proximity costs, was not protection, but its opposite. That the willingness to be known by another person is not the risk. It is the remedy. The taxi moved through the city in the early light, and the city held both of them, as cities do, without preference or judgment, providing the necessary stage for all of it, the accidents and the recoveries, the anger and the understanding, the long, complicated work of deciding, against all available evidence to the contrary, to believe in the fundamental decency of the person standing across from you. Some people find each other through patience and intention, through the careful navigation of compatible desires. And some people find each other because a luxury SUV driver looked away from the road for 3 seconds on a Wednesday morning, and a woman who had not slept properly in 3 days was exactly where she needed to be to make him understand what that cost. The city went on. The light changed. The cab turned a corner and disappeared. And somewhere across the grid of streets and avenues and intersections that made up their shared world, two people were beginning to understand that the ending of a crisis is not the end of anything. It is, if you are paying attention, if you have the particular courage to remain present when the emergency has passed and the ordinary, enormous work of living resumes, it is the beginning of everything that comes next.